Recording.
Excellent. Very good. Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Kelly. Hey, everybody. I am Colleen Sandquist with ReadSpeaker. We are so happy to partner with the CAST organization and present you today with Louise, who is going to share with us some great insights into the new Title II shifts that are coming. So, with that, thank you so much for allowing me to be here, and I'll send it to you, Louise.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Colleen. It's great to partner with ReadSpeaker and excited to talk to you today about ADA Title II requirements and what educators need to know. And we only have a half hour today, so this is going to be fast and furious, but I do have some resources that you can use to continue learning about this topic. So first of all, with every presentation we do at CAST, we start with our accessibility commitments. We are sharing the slides with you at the beginning here in a couple of different ways. One is a shortened link. The other one, in case it's blocked, as the full link. I also will have a QR code at the beginning here, so you could also scan that QR code. So there are multiple ways for you to get access to the slides. And we've done our best to make those slides as accessible as possible by checking them with a built-in Office accessibility checker. And then I also perform a manual check to make sure that the reading order is set in a logical way for screen reader users, the color contrast meets the requirements, and so on, right? So again, take those slides, feel free to personalize them to meet your needs and preferences. Now, as I said, this is going to be fast and furious, but we do have a couple of articles that we've authored from CAST. One in Tech and Learning, the Title II accessibility deadline is soon. Here's what you need to know. That would be a great one to share with your educator friends. Really try to do the best we could to really put it into educator-friendly language. And then from COSIN, the Consortium for School Networking, Title II ADA is here. CIO set the tone for what happens next. Feel free to share that with your CIO or any other leadership, right? People that are involved with procurement, with adoption, so that we're making sure that we're hitting this topic from multiple angles, right? Because it does take a community to make this effort really go and produce results. So I want to begin with defining some key terms. The Americans with Disabilities Act, right, or the ADA for short, that is our civil rights law for people with disabilities in the United States. It protects people with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of disability. And I wanted to include the date there, 1990. Some quick math, right? This is what, 36 years ago that the Americans with Disabilities Act was adopted. I did this on purpose to show you this is not new. The Americans with Disabilities Act has been around for quite some time. And in fact, the Department of Justice since at least 2003 has said that state and local government needs to make its websites accessible, right? So this is not new. Um, the Americans with Disabilities Act has 5 acts or titles to it, 5 different parts to it. Title II, which is what we're concerned with today, really focuses on state and local government entities. And guess what that includes? It includes our public schools, our public colleges and universities. And the requirement is that these state and local government entities provide equal access to their programs, their services, and their activities. Right? So that is the foundation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in 2024, the Department of Justice issued a final rule, and the final rule just added a little bit of specificity to this. And it says that state and local government must make their web content and their mobile apps accessible to people with disabilities. And they need to do that using a clear, specific accessibility standard. And the standard is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So this is an international standard for web accessibility. There are multiple versions of that. And when this final rule was issued, they settled on version 2.1. And there's a certain level, because there's different levels to WCAG. There's level A, which is basic accessibility, right? Level AA, what's practical and achievable. And level AAA, what's kind of ideal or enhanced accessibility. So they settled on version 2.1 of these standards and at level AA. So web content and mobile apps, right? That covers everything from your course content to your website to your parking app, right? anything that falls under that umbrella of web content and mobile apps needs to be accessible by meeting this standard, the WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there's some important deadlines to keep in mind, especially this first one, right? If you check your calendar, you'll notice that we're in April, right? So the first deadline is coming up, and I'll have a little bit to say about that towards the end of this presentation. But if you're an institution or an entity serving more than 50,000 people, then the deadline is very soon, April 24th of 2026. If you're a smaller entity, so you're serving less than 50,000 people, you get another year. You get until April 26th of 2027. Now, I have a really important note here. How do we figure out where you fall in terms of these deadlines? It's not your enrollment, but it's the population that you serve. So if you're a school district and you serve a town, then this would be based on the population of that town. If you're a community college and you serve a county, this will be based on the population of that county. And this is all based on the 2020 census, right? That's the latest census that we have. So I want to make sure I highlight that. It's not your enrollment, it's the population that you serve or the population that you draw from that is used to calculate when your deadline is. And there's some exceptions as part of this requirement. And there are actually five, but I've grouped three of them here on the legacy content, right? So this is content that was developed way before the final rule was issued, right? And before it goes into effect. So archive content. This is content that you're keeping around mostly for historical purposes. And by the way, the image here is a bunch of computers that are giving me some flashbacks to some of the computers that I started using when I first became aware of technology. But I'm trying to highlight that this is existing information, right? Pre-existing information. So archive content, let's say that you had a board meeting in 2018, and you have the minutes of that board meeting, and you're just keeping those minutes around for historical purposes so that you can go back if you need to refer to them. You need to make sure that that archive information is clearly indicated as an archive, right? So there's a special section of your website where information is clearly labeled as archived information, right? And it's just there for historical purposes. Pre-existing documents. So you had an event that took place in 2020, and you had a flyer for that event, right? And you don't intend to use that flyer again. That's a pre-existing document. So again, that's falls under this exception. And then finally, pre-existing social media post. So you don't have to go back to when your district joined Twitter, or now it's called X, and you started posting. You don't have to go back and make every single one of those social media posts accessible, right? So there are some exceptions here, but this is important to know. They may not apply if you update that content after the deadline, right? So April 25th, you have a pre-existing document and you update it. Well, at that point, it doesn't meet the exception anymore. Or the other important point to make here is if the pre-existing document is used to provide a service or to allow people to participate in a program or an activity, right? You still have that civil rights requirement. So you may still need to make that document accessible. So let me see if there are any questions about that. I want to make sure that we're clear on these aspects of what we're discussing today, the deadlines and some of these exceptions. And if there are no questions, I'll cover the last two exceptions. So another exception here is for personalized password protected content in documents. And that's really important, that in documents part. And the example that I have here as an image is I have a transcript, right? So a transcript is meant for an individual person, right? And it typically is provided through some sort of portal where it's password protected because it's only meant to be accessed by one individual. And if that transcript is made available as a PDF document, then we need to make sure, or you get the exception. But if you make it available as, say, HTML, then the exception doesn't apply. So it has to be a document. And again, it has to meet all those requirements. It has to be for an individual and it has to be password protected. And then the last one is a little bit tricky, which is third-party content um, that is not provided under a contractual, licensing, or other obligation. And probably the easiest thing to do here is to provide an example, right? To make it a little bit more concrete. So let's say you're a school district and you want to host a discussion board for the community. And under a contract, you purchase the discussion board platform. That needs to be accessible, the discussion board platform, because you've acquired that under a contractual or licensing agreement. The individual posts that people make to that discussion board platform, that's covered under this exception because those posts are not being made under a contractual obligation, right? So that's what we mean by that third-party content that falls outside of a contractual or licensing or other obligation. So that clause is really important, right? So I hope that's clear, that example. That's the best one that I could come up with. And there's some exceptions to the exceptions. If the content is required for a person with a disability to enjoy effective communication or to participate in or benefit from a service, program, or activity, the exceptions may not apply, right? So an individual, here's an example that I could think of. You may be able to think of others. You have content that has been archived, right, for historical purposes, but you have someone who is working on research and needs to access that archive content, and they have a disability, right? There may be a need to make that content, even though it has the archived exception. There may be a need to make that content accessible if it's part of a service, program, or activity, right? So the civil rights requirements would then trump those exceptions. And so let me pause there and see if there are any questions about the requirements, because then we'll talk about what you can do going forward to make sure that you're moving beyond compliance, right? Because I think that's really the goal here. I like to say that on April 24th, that's not the end point. That's the starting point. That's when the good work starts, right? We need to make sure that going forward, everything that we do is accessible, right? When it comes to web content and mobile apps. So April 24th is really the beginning of the journey. And we like to emphasize that accessibility is a journey at CAST. So let me see any questions for me, Kelly, that I may have missed in the chat.
Hi, Louise. I don't see any right now.
Excellent. Well, friends, if you come up with questions as we go through this presentation, feel free to drop them into the chat and I'll try to pause and answer them for you. All right. So what can you do going forward? So here's the
Louise,
thing. Yeah.
we do have a question, if you don't mind, right before you get in there. So can you put a note that says this material is archived, but if you need something archived, accessible, contract
Or contact them if you need something. Yeah, that
or
should be
contact them?
fine. Yeah, that should be fine. If you have a notice that says, if you need this in an accessible format, contact us. But make sure that it is in an area of the website, right, where it's clearly indicated. This is here for archival or historical purposes. Good question.
And we
All
have
right,
another
so
question.
yep.
Folks are worried, what would the penalties be or if they'll get sued as individual instructors?
That's a good question. I'm not going to address that one because I'm not a lawyer. And I don't want to get in trouble by talking about I only play a lawyer on TV. But definitely, if you want to discuss it with us, we could do that offline. Let's see, there is a comment here telling teachers any new data moving forward. Yes, of course. Going forward, they should be made accessible, and we'll get into that with the five-step plan that we have here, right? Um, So you notice that there was not an exception there for teacher created content. So that content needs to be made accessible going forward. By the way, I would argue it should be made accessible now. You don't have to wait until the deadline or after the deadline to make it accessible. It should be accessible now to satisfy our civil rights requirements. All right, so this can be a little bit overwhelming, right? But let me propose to you a five-step plan for how we can approach this. First of all, it's going to take some teamwork, right? It shouldn't be one person's responsibility to do this. And that will be on the next slide, who I recommend should be involved in tackling this effort. But what we propose is a five-step plan. The first thing is to conduct an audit, right? It's helpful to understand where you are right now. It's important to understand how many documents are involved. How big is our website? How many pages does it have? Where are the biggest issues? And part of that audit you can do sometimes with analytics. You can figure out like what parts of the website are used most often, what parts of the website are most critical, right? Like setting up an account, for instance, is something that's critical. That whole process needs to be accessible. And so doing an audit will give you a good sense of where you are, where the gaps exist, and give you a plan of action going forward. And you need to set some priorities, and that's the next step, which is to develop a roadmap, right? Roadmap will help you show that you're making a good faith effort going forward. Um, and so that's really important for documentation purposes. And again, we're not after perfection here. We're after continuous improvement, right? And a roadmap really sets you up on that path of continuous improvement. Next step is procurement reform, right? So I'm a big believer in using procurement as a lever for change here when it comes to accessibility, because when we procure accessible tools, we're not just meeting the needs of an individual student, we're meeting the needs of all the students that will use the tool that we procure, whether that's a content management system, learning management system, using the example that I used before, that discussion board platform, right? That's going to be used by a lot of people. So making sure that you get accessibility language into your procurement documents, into your request for proposals, right? To make sure that vendors are aware of the requirements that you have and what they need to meet in order to do business with you. The next thing is if we're going to ask people to, conform to these standards, then we need to prepare them for that. So having a plan for comprehensive staff training is really important as well. And we, because we're a CAS, would argue that that training should be developed with universal design for learning in mind, right? So that it's not just presenting information about this content, but also doing it in a way that meets the needs and preferences of everyone who's involved in that staff training. And then the final thing, which is kind of related to the roadmap, is documenting your work, right? And we highly recommend having a public accessibility statement where you state that you're committed to accessibility. Here's the standard that we're aiming for, right? That should be WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, level AA, and what you're doing and what your roadmap is, right? So keeping people informed and being transparent, that's really going to help you in the long run to, again, document that you're making a good faith effort. And as I said, this is going to be a team effort, right? And so we recommend developing a cross-functional team to work on this. And that needs to include curriculum and instruction, right? The people that are making adoption decisions need to be part of this process. Going back to the previous slide, this needs to include procurement, people that are purchasing your tools, right? That are reviewing tools for procurement and making sure that they include that procurement language that has accessibility as a consideration. Who knows the needs of your students more than your educators in your district, right? And we need to make sure that that includes both special education and general education, right? And then finally, families and our community. Many of the lawsuits that have come about as a result of districts not meeting their accessibility requirements have to do with families, right? The family member that can't access that transcript portal for the student that they're responsible for, or that can't enroll them in your system because the enrollment process is not accessible, right? So making sure that families and community are considered and included in this process. And they can be a good source of feedback as well, right? And testing things for you to make sure that they're actually not just meeting the standards, but they actually work for real people. Because we always say at CAS, accessibility is about people. It's about people's experience, not necessarily just checking the box, and making sure that you're meeting the requirements. That's important, but we need to go beyond that and making sure that we're actually meeting people's needs and preferences. So the last thing here is the final rule, question mark. So there's a little bit of uncertainty, believe it or not, even as we are very close to the deadline of April 24th. The Office of Management and Budget, right? This is part of the federal government. Uh, it announced on February 13th that it had received an interim final rule from the Department of Justice. And there's a review going on, and we don't know what the results of that review are yet. But I do want to share a website with you that you can use to continue to follow up on updates, right? Things are very fluid right now. There may still be some changes before the deadline. So I encourage you to follow Lainey Feingold. She's a disability rights lawyer, and she has a website, lflegal.com. And she has a series of updates that she's been doing since we first became aware of this process, right? For potentially changing the final rule. And she's been posting updates just about every couple of weeks on what's happening. But the last thing that I would say is remember what she says on her website. The rule is the rule until it isn't, right? So until changes are made, let's assume that this is the rule that we need to follow. So again, we just have a few days before April 24th, but I want to remind you that your work is not over on April 24th. Your work really begins on that date because that's when you're responsible, as somebody said in the chat, with everything you create going forward. That's web content and mobile apps. That needs to be accessible, right? So we're not just remediating things from the past, but we need to make sure that going forward, we're living up to these requirements. Because when the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted, right? And I mentioned that date earlier, 1990. The internet was not as big a part of our life as it is today, right? We use the internet for education, for shopping, for voting, for participating in community events, right? For parking. I can't park at my park that I go to right now without using an app where I scan a QR code. So many aspects of our lives rely on digital access. And we need to make sure then that we are creating a more inclusive experience for people in all of these different areas so that they can participate. They can be part of our communities. They can be employed. They can learn. So I want to encourage you to not see this as just a again, check the box compliance step, but really as an opportunity to think proactively about accessibility going forward. And to even not stop at accessibility, but consider universal design for learning as something that accessibility serves as a foundation for, but goes beyond that to really support learning and participation. So that's all I got for you today. I will entertain a couple of questions in the remaining time, but I will turn it back over to Colleen to see us out here.
Wow, Louise, that was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all of that information. And as I said at the top of the half hour, we are so proud to partner with CAST. ReadSpeaker has received the UDL product certification from CAST, which we are so proud about. And we just have received our WCAG 2.2 AA certification. So we are ready to go. And we have valued and embraced accessibility and universal design for as long as the company has been around. And so we're so proud to just be here with you today. If you're interested in learning more about ReadSpeaker, please feel free to scan the QR code that is on your screen right now. We would love to have a conversation with you. And if there's something that we can do to up your accessibility game, we welcome the conversation. So thanks so much for letting me be here today.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for supporting this webinar. And again, you can always also reach out to us at CAST if you have any questions or you want to work with us on training, capacity building. We're happy to work with you on that. Again, this takes a team effort with vendors, with the school districts and the state institutions that are impacted in the community. So that's right. Wendeling has a couple of good questions here. Who is your accessibility coordinator and how does one report issues? And again, that could be part of your accessibility statement. That's why easy to find accessibility statement is so important because that's where you can have that information about who it's not that that person's the sole responsible party, but it's the starting point for you to be able to connect with somebody who can address your accessibility concerns. So making sure that you have a clear point of contact and a way to report issues is really important. And to communicate what you're doing on accessibility. So again, transparency, transparency, transparency. Anything else other than that? Thank you so much for the opportunity to spend a half hour with you. I wish I could spend more, but this is a series, so please register for the rest of the series. We try to bring you practical information that you can use.